Hello everybody and welcome back to another Algebra 1 video. Today we will be continuing Chapter 9 with Lesson 9.3. This is an extension of my last video on completing the square, except for today we're just going to try more challenging problems. Here is just a refresher for what we learned in the last lesson, where we learned how to complete the square for an expression in the form x squared plus bx. Notice that in this quadratic equation, we don't have the c value, it's just x squared plus bx, but usually we would have a c value. And the purpose of completing the square is to make a perfect square trinomial that we can factor by calculating this c value right here. So we're going to follow these 3 steps below to complete the square. First, you want to find 1/2 of b, and that would just be the coefficient of x that's right here. Then you're going to square the result from step 1 and add that result from step 2 to x squared plus bx. So basically your equation for c is just b over 2 squared. And once you've added it to your x squared plus bx expression, you can go ahead and factor the resulting expression as the square of the binomial. However, to complete the square, the leading coefficient must be 1. Notice here that in our format, there is nothing in front of our x squared. So for today's lesson, we're actually going to be looking at some questions where the leading coefficient isn't 1. We're still going to follow these exact same 3 steps when completing the square, but we're going to have to do a few more extra steps at the beginning so that we can make our leading coefficient 1. Here is our very first example. We have 2x squared minus 3x plus 1 equals 0. Now notice in this quadratic equation, we have a coefficient of 2 in front of our x squared. So we're going to have to find a way to make our coefficient 1. Now it's pretty simple. Since this is an equation, you can make the leading coefficient 1 just by dividing the entire equation by 2. So if I were to do that, I would divide 2x squared by 2, I would divide minus 3x by 2, and 1 by 2, and you can also divide 0 by 2. And then that would cancel out the 2 in front of our 2x squared. That would give you x squared minus 3x over 2 plus 1/2 equals 0. And now that you have your leading coefficient of 1, you can go ahead and find your c value. The first thing you have to do though is get rid of your original c value right here just by subtracting it to the other side. And that would just give you x squared minus 3x over 2 equals to negative 1/2. Now you can find your c value. Again, remember that your c just equals to the coefficient b over 2 squared. In this case, our b value is right here. It would be negative 3 over 2. And so I would just plug in negative 3 over 2 for my b. So that would be negative 3 over 2 divided by 2 squared. And now this might look a little bit challenging because you have a fraction within a fraction, but all you have to do is break it down. This is basically just negative 3 over 2 divided by 2. And remember that when you're dividing fractions, you're going to keep the first fraction, change your division into a multiplication sign, and then flip your second fraction. So this would just equal to negative 3 over 2 times 1/2. And then if you just multiply across, it would be negative 3/4. And you've only simplified your values inside the parentheses, so now you need to square negative 3/4. And if you square it, your negative would cancel, and you would get 9 over 16. Now, if you're confused on how to square fractions, you can just break it down and do negative 3 squared over 4 squared. So just square both your values in the numerator and the denominator, and that's how you would get 9 over 16. Now that you've found your c value, you can go ahead and add it to both sides. The reason why you have to add it to both sides is because this is an equation and you have to balance it out. So this would be x squared minus 3x plus 2 plus 9 over 16 equals to negative 1/2 plus 9 over 16. Now you can go ahead and simplify the right side of your equation. The way you would do this is you want to find a common denominator between 2 and 16. I can make a common denominator of 16 just by multiplying negative 1/2 by a factor of 8 over 8. That would give me negative 8 over 16 plus 9 over 16. Now negative 8 plus 9 just simplifies to positive 1 over 16. So your final equation would simplify to x squared minus 3x plus 2 plus 9 over 16 equals to 1 over 16. And now you want to go ahead and factor the left side of your equation. The way you would do this is, since it is a perfect square trinomial, your basic format is just going to be x plus or minus a value and then squared. What you add or subtract from x is just going to be half of your b value. In this case, our b value was negative 3 over 2. If we find half of that, we would do negative 3 over 2 times 1/2, and that would give you negative 3 over 4. Since our value is negative, we're going to be doing x minus 3/4 squared. So to simplify this, we would have x minus 3/4 squared equals to 1 over 16. Now that we have our factored expression, x minus 3/4 squared equals 1 over 16, all we have to do is solve for x. So the first thing I want to do is get rid of this squared right here, and the inverse of squaring something is to square root it. So I'm going to square root both sides. If you square root x minus 3/4 squared, that just gives you x minus 3/4. And if you square root 1 over 16, again, when you're square rooting a fraction, you can just break it down as square root of 1 over square root of 16. And so that would equal to plus or minus 1 over 4. And remember that when you square anything, it's going to be both the positive and negative value. So you would get x minus 3/4 equals to plus or minus 1/4. However, you still haven't solved for your x value. So to isolate x, I'm going to add 3/4 to both sides. And that would equal to x equals to 3/4 plus or minus 1/4. And now you can just simplify this. First, you can do 3/4 plus 1/4, and that would just equal to 4/4, or just 1. And you can also do 3/4 minus 1/4, and that would just equal to 2/4, and that reduces to 1/2. So your final x values are going to be x equals 1 or x equals to 1/2. Here is another problem for us to try. We have 18n squared minus 9n minus 44 equals to 0. Now looking at this problem, just like the last one, our leading coefficient is not 1. In this case, it's 18. And since this is an equation, you can make the leading coefficient 1 just by dividing everything by 18. And so if you divide everything by 18, the 18 and 18n squared will cancel, so that just leaves you with n squared, and now our leading coefficient is 1. And then minus 9n over 18, which would just reduce to 1/2 n, and then minus 44 over 18. This would just reduce by a factor of 2 to 22 over 9, and then 0 divided by 18 is just 0. So here is your quadratic equation with a leading coefficient of 1 now. And now you can go ahead and find your c value. First thing you have to do though is get rid of your original c value, and all you have to do is do inverse operations. So since this is subtracting 22 over 9, you can just add 22 over 9 to both sides. And now you would have n squared minus 1/2 n equals to 22 over 9. And now we can find our c value. Remember that our c equals to half of our b value and then squared. In this case, our b value is -1 over 2. So I'm just going to plug in -1 over 2 for my b. That would be -1 over 2 divided by 2 squared. Again, this is a fraction within a fraction, and it might look a bit challenging, but just break it down. This is basically just -1 over 2 divided by 2 over 1. And whenever you're dividing a fraction by a fraction, you're going to keep, change, and flip. So keep your 1/2, -1/2, change your division into a multiplication sign, and then flip 2 over 1 to 1/2. And now you can go ahead and just multiply across. This would give you -1 over 4. And now that you've solved what's inside the parentheses, you can go ahead and square your -1/4, and then that would give you 1 over 16. And there's your c value. Again, if you're having trouble finding out how to square a fraction, you can go ahead and just break it down by squaring first the numerator and then squaring the denominator. And that would give you 1 over 16. Now that you've found your c value, you can add it to both sides of your equation. Remember, you have to add it both sides since it is an equation and you have to balance everything out. So this would give you n squared minus 1 over 2n plus 1 over 16 equals to 22 over 9 plus 1 over 16. So you can go ahead and simplify the right side of your equation. Now these are more larger numbers, so I'm going to make a common denominator of 144 by multiplying 22 over 9 by a factor of 16 over 16 and multiplying 1 over 16 by a factor of 9 over 9. There isn't any smaller common denominator that I can find, so if you multiply 22 times 16, that would give you 352. And then 9 times 16 would be 144. Then you're adding this to 1 over 16. 1 times 9 is just 9. And then 16 times 9 would be 144. And now that you've found a common denominator, all you have to do is add 352 plus 9. That would give you 361 over 144. Now these are larger numbers, and in the case that you can't think of a smaller common denominator, all you have to do is multiply by the factor of the other number. So in this case, I multiplied 9 by 16 and then 16 by 9. So our simplified quadratic equation is going to be n squared minus 1/2 n plus 1 over 16 equals to 361 over 144. And now you should factor your perfect square trinomial right here. Again, a shortcut is because it is a perfect square trinomial, the basic format is you're going to have a binomial of your variable n plus or minus a value squared. The value that you add or subtract to n is just going to be half of your b value. So our b value right now is -1/2. If I find out what half of that is by subtracting it by 1/2, I would get -1 over 4. And since our value is negative, you just have to subtract it from n. So that would give you n minus 1/4 squared equals to 361 over 144. Now that you have your factored perfect square trinomial, all you have to do is find your n value. First thing you want to do is get rid of your squared right here. How I'm going to do that is I'm going to square root both sides. So if you square root n minus 1/4 squared, that just gives you n minus 1/4. And then the square root of 361 over 144, you just want to take the individual square roots of 361 and 144, and that would give you 19 over 12. And remember, when you're taking the square root of something, it's going to be both the positive and negative value. So you would have n minus 1/4 equals to plus or minus 19 over 12. And now to isolate n, you're going to add 1/4 to both sides. And that would just give you 1/4 plus or minus 19 over 12. And now you can just simplify this. Now to simplify this, I would want to get a common denominator between 4 and 12. We can actually have a common denominator of 12 by multiplying 1/4 by a factor of 3 over 3. So I would have 3 over 12, and if I were to add 19 over 12, I would get that n equals to 22 over 12. 22 over 12 actually simplifies by a factor of 2 to 11 over 6. And now to find your other value of n, you can do the exact same thing, except this time you're going to subtract by 19 over 12. 3 minus 19 would just equal to negative 16 over 12, and this can reduce by 4, so negative 16 divided by 4 would just be negative 4, and 12 divided by 4 would be 3. So your two solutions for n are going to be n equals to 11 over 6 or n equals to negative 4 over 3. That is it for today's lesson. Please make sure to subscribe. I really appreciate your support. I try to create all my content so that students can easily access it for free and thrive in their math classes. As always, all information regarding lesson requests, additional practice, and tutoring are going to be found down below in the description box. Again, thank you so much for watching, and if you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me at kaylin.david24@gmail.com. I hope to see you in the next video.